The peak of the business cycle is often accompanied by increases in prices, which is generally referred to as inflation. At the end of this tutorial, you should be able to define the terms inflation, cost-push inflation, and stagflation. You should also be able to describe the causes of demand-pull inflation as well as cost-push inflation and illustrate the two types of inflation on an aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. Inflation is the percent increase in the price level of a given economy. Deflation is the percent decrease in the price level of a given economy. There are two ways inflation can be measured, either using a percent change in GDP deflator or a percent change in price index. The general formula is the quantity of the price level minus 1 times 100%. Let's look at a few examples. In this example, the GDP deflator is used to measure the price level. The inflation rate is calculated using the GDP deflator. The formula is the quantity of the price level minus 1 times 100%. Since the GDP deflator used to measure the price level, the price can be replaced by the GDP deflator. According to the problem, the GDP is 1.15, so it would be substituted into the formula. The formula now reads the quantity of 1.5 minus 1 times 100%. Subtracting 1 from 1.5, the GDP deflator is equal to 0.15. Multiplying 1.5 times 100% is equal to 15%. This means that each dollar of a price of good the computer will pay an additional 15 cents for, or a good that cost $10 in the past will now cost $11.50. In this example, a price index is used to measure the price level. The inflation rate is calculated using a price level. The formula is the quantity of the price level minus 1 times 100%. Since a price index is used to measure the price level can be replaced by the price index. According to the problem, the price index is 1.20, so it would be substituted into the formula. The formula now reads the quantity of 1.20 minus 1 times 100%. Subtracting 1 from the 1.20, the price index, is equal to 0.20. Multiplying 0.20 by 100% is equal to 20%. This means that each dollar of price of the good the consumer will now pay an additional 20 cents for it, or that a good that cost $10 in the past will now cost $12. Inflation is the percent change in the price level of a given economy. Inflation may be unexpected or unanticipated, or expected or anticipated. Unexpected inflation or unanticipated inflation is an increase in the price level that consumers do not expect to occur. Expected inflation or anticipated inflation is an increase in the price level that consumers do expect to occur. There are three types of inflation. Demand-pull inflation, which is caused by an increased demand for goods and services by all sectors of the economy. Cost-push inflation is caused by increases in prices of essential inputs to the economy, such as labor and energy. And monetary inflation, which is caused by increases in the amount of money in circulation. We will look later at monetary inflation. Before looking at demand-pull inflation, it might be useful to review the basic aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve graph as an economist sees it. The first thing to remember is that the horizontal axis represents real GDP, and that real GDP increases as one moves from left to right. The second thing to remember is that the vertical axis represents the price level. Also remember that the price level increases as one moves upward. In an inflationary situation, economists assume that the aggregate supply curve is fixed. This means that the aggregate supply curve is drawn as a vertical line at some level of real GDP. In the graph, notice that the aggregate supply curve AS0 is fixed at a real GDP of Y0. The aggregate demand curve continues to be drawn as a downward sloping demand curve. The name of the aggregate demand curve is AD0. The place where the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curve cross each other is the equilibrium point E0. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the price level, a equilibrium price level is found. Notice that we don't need to find the equilibrium real GDP because the aggregate supply curve is fixed at y sub 0, which is also going to be the aggregate equilibrium GDP. Demand pull inflation means that the demand for all goods and services shifts to the right. This situation comes about when the government starts increasing its spending. At the same time, companies begin to buy more capital goods like machines for production, and consumers begin to demand more because their incomes are increasing as a result of the increase in government expenditures and expenditures by firms for new capital goods. When the government, firms, and customers begin to increase their demand for goods and services, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. The new aggregate demand curve is called AD1. The place where AD1 crosses the aggregate supply curve creates a new equilibrium point, E1. If a line is drawn from the new equilibrium point to the price level axis, it is easy to see that the price level and hence prices have increased to a new higher level. One thing to note about demand pull inflation is that there is generally little unemployment associated with it. Indeed, the economy may be working at full employment and only prices are increasing. Before looking at cost push inflation, it might be useful to review the basic aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve graph as an economist sees it. The first thing to remember is that the horizontal axis represents the real GDP. Also remember that real GDP increases as one moves from left to right. The second thing to remember is the vertical axis represents the price level. Also remember that price level increases as one moves upwards. In inflationary situations, economists assume that the aggregate supply curve is fixed. So this means that the aggregate supply curve is drawn as a vertical line at some level of real GDP. In the graph, notice that the aggregate supply curve, AS0, is fixed at a real GDP of Y0. The aggregate demand curve continues to be a downward sloping demand curve. The name of the demand curve is AD0. The place where the aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve cross each other is the equilibrium point E0. If a line is drawn from the equilibrium point to the price level axis, the equilibrium price level is found. Notice that we don't need to find the equilibrium real GDP because the aggregate supply curve is fixed at Y0. As you may remember from the lecture on individual supply curves and market supply curves, when the price of an input increases, the supply curve will shift to the left. If the input is necessary for all goods and services, the increases in price will cause the aggregate supply curve to shift to the left. There are two examples of inputs which are used in all goods. The first is oil, because it's used to make gasoline, heating oil, plastics, and many other products, as well as being the primary energy source for vehicles in our economy. Another example is labor. Every product that we make requires some labor in order to produce it. If either of these two commodities increase in price, the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left. If the aggregate supply curve shifts from AS0 to AS1, the equilibrium point will change from E0 to E1. As a result, the real GDP will decline from Y0 to Y1. If a line is drawn from E1 to the price level axis, the new higher price level is created, P1. Notice that GDP declines from Y0 to Y1. The result of this decline is that unemployment will increase because of the decline in GDP. Thus, there are two results of cost-push inflation. First, the price level increases from P0 to P1, which is higher, which implies the price of all the goods and services are increasing. Second, there will be an increase in the unemployment because as GDP declines, unemployment increases. A popular term in the late 1970s used to describe cost-push inflation was stagflation. Stagflation accurately describes what cost-push inflation does to the economy. That is, we get both high prices and stagnation in the economy.